Hello to everyone. My name is Apostolos Papadopoulos. I'm professor of rural sociology and geography at the Department of Geography at Harrow University of Athens. And I'm very pleased to be here. Many thanks for the invitation to chair this session. I'm also pleased because the issues that will be raised in this panel are very, very interesting. And also I'm very pleased because it's the other way around. Men are a minority. I'm the minority in this panel. And whereas in most panels on migration, there are many, many men speaking and women in the audience. The title of this panel is to bring the discussion to the migration systems from Southeast Asia to European Union, to Greece and the European Union, and also keep a comparative perspective. It's designed as it is designed. The first paper will be on Pakistani immigration to Greece, and then the second one, Pakistani immigration to Europe, and then another couple of presentations dealing with Afghan migrants to Greece and to Europe. So I'm giving the floor to Michaela Marufov, who is the first speaker.
Hello, everyone. After yesterday's long presentations, I don't know how many of you were there here yesterday, but I'll try to keep my presentation of the findings of IRMA for the case of Pakistani migrants as short as possible. To begin with, what emerges from the fieldwork conducted for this project, which included 30 interviews with Pakistani migrants currently residing in Greece and 10 interviews with Pakistani migrants who had signed up for assisted voluntary return programs, and 5 interviews with Pakistanis in Pakistan via Skype who were considering migrating at some point but decided not to do so. One of the first findings was that while Greece is mainly seen as a pathway to Europe for many Asian and African countries, for some Pakistanis it did constitute a destination country. I mean, they left Pakistan in order to come to Greece, not some other European country. This probably was linked to the fact that Greece had been a transit country in the past for Pakistanis, and also maybe it was influenced by the regularization programs of 1998 to 2005. Currently, the Greece is not considered. Not currently. At the time of the research, it was not considered a good option either as a migration destination nor as a transit country. I'll get into that later. With regards to the motivation for migration, in terms of push and pull theory, the main push factors for Pakistani migrants include unemployment and low wages, and the lack of sense of security, as well as poor living conditions, while among the key pull factors attracting migrants to Europe, we can note the availability of jobs, the better working conditions, and the better life standards. We cannot overlook the central role of Pakistani migrants' families in the migration decision making. In fact, 11 of our interviewees explicitly stated that during the decision making, their families played a central role to that decision. So in those cases, migration was more of a collective decision than an individual one. When they were referring to family, they were mostly referring to their parents and their siblings who were in need of support. And the burden usually fell on the shoulders of the oldest son or the oldest unmarried son, because once they got married, they had to take care of their own family, not their siblings and their parents. We should also note the role of the social networks in generating migration by facilitating and spreading information with regards to the labor market opportunities, and of course the role of the smuggling networks in the same way. The majority of our interviewees did in fact decide to migrate for economic purposes, either due to lack of employment or due to the low pay of employment in Pakistan, and after consulting with their families. However, their main expectations were not restricted. You can see some quotes from my interviews. They were not restricted in mere survivals for themselves and their families. All in all, when considering the reasons for migrating from Pakistan to Greece, economic reasons cannot easily be separated from the construction of social identities in a country where the national culture has been largely defined by the migratory process. Now, once someone has decided to embark upon such a journey, traveling using a visa is not much of an option for most of our interviewees. It was never considered a way of entering Europe or Greece. So they had to resort to smugglers in order to achieve this mobility. According to the migrants' narratives, the standard route followed is via Iran and Turkey, while the arrangements of the journey are made in Pakistan. In many cases, the interviewees did hold visas that allowed them to enter Iran, but that was not the case with entering Turkey and Greece. In fact, only one among our interviewees entered Turkey holding a visa and continued his journey to Greece in an irregular manner. In effect, it has been brought to our attention by both the migrants interviewed in Greece and in civil society organizations interviewed in Turkey, because we also tried to go to Turkey and interview migrants who were in transit from Turkey to Greece. But we were unable to achieve that because based on interviewed migrants and NGOs, they spent their entire stay or most of the stay in Turkey in safe houses provided by the smugglers, as they are instructed to avoid going outside out of fear of being intercepted by the police, the Turkish police. Another important aspect emerging from the interview concerns the cost of the journey, which ranges between 3,000 euros and 8,000 euros. The arrangement for the amount is usually made before the journey, and the immigrants are not expected usually to pay the entire sum at once. Often they pay part of it in the beginning and some of it upon arrival, or even in a longer period of time after they start working. So the negotiations between the migrants and the smugglers come up with different agreements on the amount and the way of payment. The prospective migrants collect the required funds either by sacrifices pieces of their personal or family fortune, for instance, by selling pieces of land, small businesses, houses, or even items such as jewelry or cars, or by relying on their social networks, mainly receiving loans by the members of their extended families. Or in some cases, they receive the funding from family members who are already abroad, like a brother or a cousin who is already in the destination country could fund their journey and then expect to receive the money back. Now, once in Greece, usually Pakistani migrants are expected to find supports within their networks in order to find work and a place to stay for the beginning of the period. This is the unemployment rates, it's not rates actually, it's numbers, but based on the labor force survey. According to the census of 2011, 30% of the Pakistanis residing in Greece were unemployed. And actually this corresponds very well to the findings of our own research, since many of the interviewed migrants were either unemployed when interviewed or working occasionally as daily laborers, or in some cases street vendors who were selling CDs were saying that they're not able to support themselves anymore due to the crisis. And also we even found persons who were collecting scrap and selling the metal, who were saying that this only provides for them an income of €5 per day, which does not allow you to even support yourself here, not send money back to your family, of course. So the situation is quite hard, not only for the people who arrived soon after the outbreak of the crisis, but also for people who were here years before and continued staying. With regards to the status, the legal status of Pakistanis, we can, there are high numbers of irregular persons residing in the countries, and during the last few years, Greece has implemented a series of measures aimed at controlling irregular migration, both at the border and within the country, including the increased police presence in border areas, the strengthening of controls at the points of exit, intensifying the controls within the country, as well as creating pre-departure detention centers and extending the maximum detention time of undocumented migrants to 18 months. This has, of course, created lots of disruption for the specific communities, as they are a very visible minority, and so many of them try not to circulate so much within the cities in fear of being detected and held. Now, the majority of our interviewees had entered the country after 2005, so they did not have access to the regularization programs that have been in effect. So one of the alternative strategies used by Pakistani migrants was to apply for asylum and use it in order to be able to circulate within the country with the pink card, let's call it, which is a proof that you have applied for asylum. The old asylum system had created a big backlog, let's say, and this meant that their asylum applications were, someone could be an applicant for even 5 or 7 years without his case being examined. So this allowed them lots of time in that situation. In 2013, the new asylum service was launched, which had a much faster rate of processing applications. So this is no longer an option for those who did not apply before that. I mean, they are able to apply, but chances are that the decision will be reached within a few months. So even in case they are not actually have ground to become refugees or have subsidiary protection, they will be held or deported. And in fact, even persons who were held in pre-departure centers who did apply for asylum from inside the centers were continued to be held in the centers until the result of the decision was reached. So it did not serve the purpose that it used to serve in the past, the asylum application, I mean. So this brings us to now. As I already said, the current situation, both in the labor market and until recently the detention situation has made Greece not an attractive destination or transit country. But for those who are here, they're faced with very serious dilemmas because on one hand, those who are irregular and are not detained, they have to weigh their options and decide whether they want to return to their country of origin, which is often the case, or stay and try to find some work, which some do because they still owe the money they used for migrating. So going back, it's not much of an option. Some also try to collect money in order to remigrate to other European countries using alternative routes, not so much the Italian route anymore. And of course, there's also, we have conducted interviews with detainees at the time who, again, while being detained, while knowing that they might be detained for up to 18 months, some of them did decide to return because it would be pointless to lose 18 months in a Greek detention facility, but for others, going back was not an option, as either they still owed the money, so they would be in debt when going back, or some of them had really good grounds to claim asylum or subsidiary protection, but they also, for the same reasons, did not have the option to return because they would still be in danger back home. So I think I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Michaela for giving us a detailed account of Pakistani migration to Greece. but also pointing out that Pakistani's strategy, migration plans changed once being in Greece, and once being in the context of the economic recession, Pakistanis started to reconsidering their migration plans and thinking of going or moving further to another EU country, which is indicative of the endless trip of migration of migrants. Having said that, I'll give the floor to Megan Hendo, who is going to speak about migration from Pakistan to Europe.
Thank you, and I also wanted to say thank you to our hosts, particularly IRMA for organizing this very interesting conference, and also for inviting me to speak. I've tried to organize my presentation to be complementary to Michaela's. It's based primarily on a study that was on migrant smuggling from Pakistan, from Pakistan via Turkey to Greece. So I can also say that a lot of what Michaela has discussed we also found in our research. I'm going to instead focus a little bit more on the constraints with regard to labor migration from Pakistan and how the opportunity structures impact the structure and organization of migration from Pakistan to Greece. So first I'll go a bit over the background of the situation and the main characteristics of migrants, and then go a bit more into the statistics that are available and the different ways Pakistanis can migrate to Europe, and then trying to summarize in terms of the different processes in terms of labor migration. So first, in terms of background, this echoes what Michaela said, of course, that for Pakistanis coming from migrating from Pakistan towards Europe, the main motives for migrating from Pakistan are economic and political. So rising inflation, increasing consumer price index, unemployment, and decreasing economic growth and investment in Pakistan, combined with increased destabilization, social unrest, extremism, and sectarian-related violence. I want to also touch upon who is migrating from Pakistan towards Europe. Obviously Pakistani, and I will go into their characteristics in a moment, but I also do want to touch upon Afghans, as they are also noted particularly as a key nationality transiting through Pakistan before then traveling to Europe. There's a large portion of long-term irregular Afghan migrants in Pakistan, as well as refugees. The Pakistani National Alien Registration Authority estimated a total of 3.35 million irregular migrants, of which 2.2 million are estimated as being Afghan, 1 million Bangladeshi, and the remaining are identified as Iraqi, Somalis, and stateless persons, including Bengali, Bihari, and Rohingya. And we heard a bit more about these different groups from the presentation from Januk yesterday. In addition to this, there's 1.5 million registered refugees with UNHCR. I want to highlight this particularly because of there's an important factor in their onward movement is their situation in their host country, and this is particularly relevant with regard to Pakistan on the one hand, but also Iran on the other. In Pakistan, they're currently in a quite sensitive situation. For example, when Afghan official registration cards issued by Pakistan are up for renewal, and for your information, they will expire at the end of 2015, it regularly happens that there's a strong increase in negative media and government statements on Afghan refugees. Combined with this, the Peshawar attack of December 2014 led to an immediate increase in this negative rhetoric, as well as security sweeps targeting specifically irregular Afghan migrants for arrest and expulsion. As an indication of the pressure on Afghans in Pakistan, for the first 10 weeks of 2015, more Afghans returned to Afghanistan than during the entire year of 2014. A caveat to this, of course, is that there were lower returns. These returns are mostly facilitated by UNHCR. But the caveat is that 2014 returns were low due to the NATO withdrawal and elections in Afghanistan, so there was a lot of uncertainty among that population. While this does not obviously directly mean that more have chosen to move towards Europe, particularly also due to the costs that would entail, it indicates a high pressure for Afghans to leave the country. I also wanted to highlight the situation in Iran. There's a parallel situation in terms of Afghans. There in 2012-2013, there was a significant rise of Afghan asylum seeker arrivals from Iran to Turkey. Economic sanctions on Iran led the government to informally and formally remove Afghans from the country. There's Amnesty International reports on this. And as also an indication, more asylum seekers approached UNHCR in Turkey in 2012 than in the previous 10 years combined. And in May 2013, UNHCR suspended processing of new Afghan arrivals. So this is just something to keep in mind, because at times when we're discussing the route of irregular migration from Pakistan via Iran and Turkey to Europe, to Greece particularly, there's an assumption or a discussion of Afghans coming from via Pakistan, but this kind of shows also that their situation in other host countries push them onward as well. Frontex data shows a huge increase of detections and apprehensions of Afghans along the external border in 2014. It's more than double the amount of detections in 2014 as compared with the previous year. At all borders. And also clandestine entries at border crossing points increased by a factor of at least 6. So yeah, again, this is the same caveat then applies that in addition to the expulsions from Iran, this is also combined with the uncertainty that I mentioned before in returning to Afghanistan. So that may have pushed people onwards to Turkey, and then I can't say with any certainty, but there could be onward movement also from Turkey then to Greece. Frontex data in this sense is suggestive, but obviously not conclusive. In terms of characteristics of smuggled migrants, and I want I'll go a bit more into why I've chosen to highlight these characteristics. But for those being smuggled to Europe by land or sea, Pakistani migrants are primarily middle income or landholders between the ages of 18 and 13 with strong diaspora ties and mid to long-term intention to stay in the EU. The same report by UNODC also categorizes Afghan smuggled migrants as male between the ages of 18 and 30 with also strong diaspora ties and tending to be slightly more educated and more financially well-off than the average Afghan. What is interesting here is that obviously the mode of arrival to the EU impacts the main characteristics of the group. It's clear that those arriving from air, due to the cost, have higher income. They also tend to be more well-educated with English skills, and they also tend to be asylum seekers. I want to kind of, with this slide, I want to discuss how these migration opportunities frame how migration from Pakistan to the EU occurs. So on the one hand, of course, legal opportunities, and then on the other, irregular migration. In terms of labor recruitment, for official labor recruitment, statistics from the Ministry of Overseas Pakistanis and Human Resource Development, they organize official labor recruitment in Pakistan, and 96% of official labor recruitment from Pakistan goes to the GCC countries. Of that official labor recruitment, 1% goes to Europe. And then in addition to this, interviews with stakeholders in Pakistan highlighted that there's also a number of people that go on student or tourist visas, but there's not accurate knowledge on how many of those people then gain employment once in Europe or overstay. There's also not accurate data on those going to Europe on employment contracts that are not organized officially. So this is something that was touched upon by Danouk yesterday, and I just want to also highlight here is that data on migration from Pakistan is extremely problematic and limited and definitely not comprehensive. So that's just a caveat at the moment. Then, yeah, as I mentioned before, student and tourist visas are one means of traveling to the EU, and a specific issue has been overstayers. And you'll see this in the next slide with regard to data from Frontex on illegal stay. Another thing to note is asylum claims in the EU in 2014 of Pakistanis. There were over 600,000, but this also highlights that there are some gray areas, let's say, where, as I mentioned before, student or tourist visas, a legal form of migration, might then turn into an irregular status by overstaying. In asylum, in the case of asylum, there are indications that someone may have entered irregularly and then made an asylum claim upon entry. In terms of irregular migration, and this is something that I really wanted to highlight, was that for unofficial and unregistered labor recruitment, this would be primarily to the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe. There's a particularly low amount of official requests and officially organized labor migration to these countries, and there's also a gray area there because it's not organized by the official by the ministry. So, for example, there's issues of certain unregistered labor recruiters. They could be organizing real visas, but they also could be organizing false ones. They could be giving a Pakistani potential migrant a work contract, but a common issue, and this is what we also saw in interviews, was the issue of skimming. So, for example, someone would have a contract to go to Canada for 400,000 and receive 400,000. The contract would state they receive 400,000 Pakistani rupees per month, but they actually only receive 200,000. So that money then goes to it's unclear whom, but definitely not the migrant. Another common issue is fraud. So in terms of labor recruiters that offer migration, but then they run off with the money. And these two issues in particular, skimming and fraud, were specifically noted by interviews, and also the current draft national migration policy of Pakistan as key areas to be improved in Pakistani migration policy. Another way, of course, in terms of irregular migration to Europe is migrant smuggling, which Michaela went more in detail in terms of prices and modes. In these cases, usually employment is not secured beforehand, and there is a focus on longer-term stay. There's a variety of different routes. Pakistan, Turkey, Greece is the primary route to Europe, but there's also routes to the UAE via Iran and Oman, to Europe via Central Asian republics. Previous route that is no longer really used is through the Middle East and then to West Africa and Spain. And then another route which was touched upon by Marie and Danouk, of the air route to Thailand and Malaysia, and then subsequently to Indonesia and Australia by boat. Also, of course, due to recent policies, this is no longer as relevant. Then lastly, there's an air route that goes directly to Europe, the US, Middle East, or Southeast Asia for the route towards Australia. Again, yeah, I want to note again here the lack of comprehensive data on irregular migration. Due to, obviously, its hidden nature, irregular migration and human smuggling can't be measured precisely, and so and there aren't any sufficiently developed statistics on these key areas for assessing the scale. So I've included the data here from Frontex, from the Federal Investigation Agency of Pakistan, and from Eurostat to kind of indicate particularly that Pakistanis are consistently among the highest nationalities apprehended and identified. I can't say anything clearly about the scale, but that it's clear that, at least from Frontex data, the first 5, they're consistently among the top 10 apprehended nationality of apprehended migrants along the external borders. For illegal border crossing by maritime arrival, Michaela did note a high number of apprehensions along the Greek border, but it is not the top nationality identified in 2014, at least. For Pakistan as well, what's important is I've included the deportation information from the Federal Investigation Agency. For them, deportations from Greece and UK are some of the top countries from which Pakistanis are deported. In addition to this, there are also, I haven't included here, but there's also data on Oman and UAE, and also I included here Turkey because it's relevant particularly for the route. And this is the last slide. I don't know if it's visible or understandable, but what I kind of wanted to summarize here is I wanted to show in this table how information flow and opportunities for Pakistani migrants impact the migrants' decision making, particularly with regard to labor migration. So we've seen with the smuggling route that's not necessarily organizing employment beforehand, but for example, if somebody wants to organize labor migration before leaving, they can go through these various means. So either going from the top left, you self-organize by job portals or the internet. This tends to be highly skilled migrants with extensive networks of their own. There's also, if you get information on opportunities from family, friends, and networks, this could either be an opportunity for a Pakistani migrant to privately or individually organize employment in the EU, or it could lead you to subcontracted agents. And this is something we found in our research that often these recruiters use broader networks in terms of offering either smuggling services on the one hand, but also unregistered labor migration in the term of these unofficial labor recruiters that I mentioned before. And this is particularly to the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe as prime destination countries. It's a similar, I guess, word of mouth is connected with family, friends, and networks, and this would also lead you either to subcontracted agents or to official recruitment agencies. So if your desire is to go to the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe, you would get information, and we've heard that people know where to go. They have the information from friends, from family, from word of mouth on who to contact on arranging employment in those destination countries. But if you want to go for a shorter term, just to gain money and return, then you go to the GCC. And this is primarily through the recruitment agencies, and this is overseen by the Ministry of Overseas Pakistanis and Human Resource Development. And you can either use the official Overseas Employment Corporation, which is a public recruitment agency, or you can use overseas employment promoters. And the same issues that I mentioned before with regard to skimming also come there. So for unregistered labor migration, obviously it's unclear going into it whether for migrants going into it, they have to trust their family, friends, their networks. They have to trust that the person's not going to cheat them and accept the possibility that there would be skimming. For overseas employment promoters, there is a real job available, primarily, again, in the GCC, but there still might be issues of skimming. Issues of exploitation also come across the board here, but I won't go into detail on that. Another thing that's relevant is from the bottom up, let's say, the reason why registered labor migration is primarily to the GCC is because there's specific requests from private companies and governments for workers. So in the case of these countries, they send it to Overseas Employment Promoters Association, to these different corporations, and they organize then the recruitment. The last means of information is national newspaper ads, and these are only done by recruitment agencies. So once the recruitment agency receives the okay from via the ministry, based on a request from a specific government or a private company, they then put a newspaper advertisement out saying, there's this many people required to go to the UAE to do something or other. And this is the one way where it's completely clear then to the migrant what is being offered, what then the salary would be, and they go through a specific or process in that regard. So I guess what I wanted to say with this fairly complicated graphic was that for migrants in terms of decision making, if they want to go short term to the GCC countries and make money to bring back to Pakistan, they would go through primarily the official route. On the other hand, then, if you want to go to other destination countries, for example, US, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and we're obviously talking here specifically about Europe, but if you want to go to any of those destinations, you have to go the unregistered route. And this is where there are key issues that I mentioned before in terms of uncertainties for migrants. You get information in a variety of different ways, and you take a risk in terms of what might be offered to you once you get there, and what the reality might be. That's I don't know how much time I took, but that's the gist of my presentation.
Many thanks to Megan, who provided us an overview of the migration movements of Pakistanis to Europe. What is striking from her presentation is that she attempted in the end to give us a kind of actor's perspective of as how the migration system works as far as the Pakistani is concerned, and the main agencies and how these are implicated in the migration movement of Pakistanis, which is interesting. And also we saw the complexity of the migrant decisions, which is another issue which could be discussed later. Now I turn to the next presenter is Angeliki Dimitriadi. She's going to speak about Afghan irregular migrants in Greece, and she says Europe is elsewhere. Okay, with this provocative title.
Especially Afghans, or?
Well, I think they were onto something.
Okay.
When they gave that quote. Hello from me as well.
Did they know something before we knew?
I think they were better informed, yes. So we've been mentioning the Afghans for the past 2 days, so now you get to hear about the Afghans once more. What I want to do is 3 things with this presentation. I want to start off by giving you a brief idea of the complexities around discussing Afghan migration. Then I want to turn into taking you through their journey to Greece, their aspirations and their motivations, and how they decide their destination, their final destination. And then I want to conclude with the arrival in Greece and the experience of living in Greece, particularly because at the time when the fieldwork took place, we had a very drastic change in our management policies. So we had extensive detentions, deportations, and the infamous Xenia Zeus operation, which was a show your paper policy. And all of these things, from the aspirations all the way to the arrival, have shaped in one way or another the way the Afghans approach Greece, which is Europe is elsewhere. Greece is in the geography of Europe, but it's not part of the imaginary of Europe. It's a transit destination to begin with. It continues being a transit destination upon arrival. And this fundamentally shapes their entire migratory journey from beginning to end. So I think I'm pointing there. Yeah, okay. So what is the profile of the Afghan migration? Afghans are neither migrants nor refugees, or in fact, not all are migrants and not all are refugees. They shift from one category to another into what, and in fact, a single person could be at one point of their lives a migrant and at another a refugee. This is the result of what Mansouri had called the multidirectional cross-border movement and the ongoing cyclical nature of migration that blurs the boundaries between refugee and migrant. It is part of their history, the constant mobility. Almost 80% of the sample at the time of the research had migrated from Afghanistan, and only the remaining 2 from Iran and Pakistan. And this is actually a critical finding, especially for me, because I had looked at the Afghans in the past, and it was the reverse. It was 80% from Iran and Pakistan, and only 20 from Afghanistan. And the shift, the increase of direct migration from Afghanistan is an indication of the situation on the ground. They represent the middle class that rose during the presence of the foreign troops, that is now fearing for its life following the Allied withdrawal. So they're fleeing en masse. And at the time, you also have what Megan spoke about, the massive deportations taking place from Iran and Pakistan, which create a constant push factor for them to search for alternative destinations. We're also seeing a second shift. Because migration has shaped the social and economic fabric of the country, and mobility is a key livelihood strategy, initially was deployed by single men only. So 90% of the Afghans arriving in Greece were primarily men. But in the recent years, we're seeing a change. Now this strategy is deployed by families primarily, which is a change, unaccompanied minors, and also women traveling alone or with their children, which is unique in the context of the Afghan migration, especially towards Europe. And almost everyone arrives entirely undocumented. Afghans, 99% of them do not have papers. The majority of them had never been registered, at least the ones that come to Greece, had never been registered neither in Afghanistan or in Iran. So in theory, they don't belong anywhere. And even if we would like to return them, we have no country that would accept them as part of their return process. So what are their motives for migrating? It's very complex, but it could be boiled down to asylum. But asylum in turn becomes very complex for them. They seek asylum, but the motives behind it are mixed, and they also influence their destination choices. So the political context is one of the most commonly cited reasons. The Taliban or withdrawal of the Allied forces, some regional conflicts that exist in certain areas with the bombings. So obviously that's the first thing that they cite for leaving, especially directly from Afghanistan, but also from Pakistan, especially near the border areas. Family vendettas was another reason that was offered for fleeing. Employment, which was interestingly enough not the primary motive. And this was curious because when they were asked, they mentioned that they were not regularly employed in any of the 3 countries. In fact, most of them had been employed for months or for years. And when they were working in very low-paid jobs. Yet employment for them is integrated in the asylum process. So when they discuss asylum, they don't see it as a protection paper. They don't see it as the refugee passport, which is sufficient because they will not be returned and they will be protected from conflict. They see it as a holistic package. It would allow them integration into society. It would offer them the chance to receive some training. And this is where education comes in. And it's also one of the reasons that is cited for them for coming to Europe. So they would receive education, they would be trained, they would be able to enter the labor market. They would also eventually get some sort of permanent status in the country. They would eventually begin a new life. So asylum is much broader than the way we understand it, especially in the initial screening process of new arrivals. And this obviously shapes their choice of destinations. And it's reflected because if you look at it, I've only included the top 5 choices that they mentioned in our sample. Germany, for example, is number 1. Everybody wants to go to Germany. And that's not an accident because their information is old and it's based on a system that offered everything that I've just talked about. Sweden is a popular destination, and so is the UK. Again, the information is old because the systems are changing quite rapidly. An interesting reference for me is Europe, which goes back to the original title. When they speak about Europe, the logical question for me is, well, you're in Greece. And then the answer that follows is, no, Europe. I mean, I want to go to Europe. Because in Greece, we do not offer any of the things that I've just mentioned. We may offer the refugee passport now within your asylum service or some form of protection, but essentially we don't give them anything else. So again, Europe is somewhere else.